Hello, welcome to this video. It's Top 10 December, and in December we are putting out Top 10 videos, although if I get them edited quick, it might be at the end of November. It's not really, but I have decided, because I haven't been doing that many Top 10 videos, and because I've been doing a lot of other videos on other subjects, I thought, let's get back to some Top 10s. Let's deliver some Top 10s. Let's just do Top 10 anything. Let's do the Top 10 sheep, or the Top 10 ways of scratching your back with a stick. And I'm going to do them all, but I'm starting with more generalised ones, but I am stretching out a little bit. And on this video, I'm going to be looking at the 10 greatest movie soundtracks. These are albums I own. We're not talking about the film, we're talking about the album. The album I own from a soundtrack, from a film. And I've got a whole bunch of them here. Now, there is one from a sort of musical. Now, I could have loads of musicals on here, but I decided I don't want to do that. I want the soundtrack on. And there is one where I've broken that rule. Right, so let's get straight into it, right? And at number 10, I have the Sicilian Clan from the film The Sicilian Clan by Ennio Morricone. Ennio Morricone was one of the greats, wasn't he? He was the one that scored all the movies for the soundtracks for like the spaghetti westerns like Fistful of Dollars, A Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And he had this very sort of European orchestral approach, drawing from the sort of Italian tradition, but fused with sort of burgeoning rock and roll instrumentation. So he's got like a lot of stinging electric guitars in there, lots of percussion effects, harmonicas and all that type of stuff. And his ability to arrange with these incredible sounds and create these incredible they're like new filmic devices to push the storyline through, where he seems to have a way of embodying these new anti-heroes that are emerging in these spaghetti westerns. Now, if you then fast forward to films like The Mission, for example, you've got some incredible, just lush orchestral music. But my favourite soundtrack is actually for a film called The Sicilian Clan, which is early 70s, I think. It looks, but I think it's a European film. I don't know that much about the film. I actually came to this soundtrack through John Zorn. John Zorn has done a tribute to Ennio Morricone, which is where I first discovered Ennio Morricone. And I think he does the theme to the Sicilian Clan on one of the Naked City albums. I think the very first Naked City album. And that drew me to it. And there's a wonderful... What I love about Ennio Morricone is the choice of instrumentation. And although I like the sort of stinging and electric guitar things that he did for the spaghetti westerns, there's something where he almost has a sort of dulcimer sound and sort of using Greek balalaikas and that. And it's got a twang to it, which really goes with the Sicilian Clan film, which is this sort of European, exploration of the mafia. So that's where I'm going to start. I wish I could tell you a little bit more about it, but I don't know that much about it. I know one more fact about Ennio Morricone that I will tell you now, that his way of scoring his films was incredible. This is a proper musician. He would literally go into the cinema and they would put the film on, and then in the dark, he developed a system where he could sit there and not look. I don't know if it was like Braille or some number system or whatever it was, but he would just watch the film, hear the music in his head, and then just somehow document it on this with this system in the dark. It's insane, I have been involved every now and then in trying to create soundtracks for films, and I find it very frustrating. Well, not for films, but for experimental films or media, or say I've also been created incidental music for plays and stuff. And you create your masterpiece, you send it over, and they go, "It's really great, but we've extended that bit now, so we need 2.5 minutes more, not 8 bars more." And then it's fine. You go, "Well, I've written it," and you have to suddenly extend it, and I can't do it because I thought, "Well, I've written it. That's the way it is." And now I've got to change. It's only going to get worse now. And that is a very difficult thing to negotiate. At number 9, I have the Ipcress File, which was composed by John Barry, who was also the composer behind the James Bond themes. I think my favourite James Bond theme by John Barry would be On Her Majesty's Secret Service. He also wrote the incredible music for Born Free, for example. And I've also got the album Out of Africa, which is again a very later compositions by John Barry, which are much more orchestral and lush. But the Ipcress File, which is a film made around about 64, 65, and was made from a book which was as a reaction sort of to the glamour of James Bond. And this new anti-hero again of Harry Palmer is a undercover sort of spy, but a lot more down to earth, you know, and he's a fan of cooking, and he's got glasses, and those films are really, really iconic and brilliant. The best one is the first one, the Ipcress File. And John Barry, you hear those signature approaches with John Barry, you know, the sort of scoring the strings in octaves, the sort of, again, use of sort of zithers and balalaikas and those sort of twang, and you get these sort of harp-like arpeggios, and it's just so incredible and beautiful. And I got a bit, there's a harmonic approach to John Barry, which when I hear it evokes something very deep in me. I don't know whether it goes back to my childhood or what it is, but I think the two really emblematic sounds of the 1960s for me would be the Beatles and John Barry. That's how I sort of, they're related in my mind. So that's what I got at number 9, is the Ipcress File by John Barry. At number 8, I have the orchestral score. There's a full orchestral proper. I thought I've got to have some proper Hollywood soundtracks on here, and this was one that I absolutely love. It's by Alex North, and it is the soundtrack to Spartacus, Kirk Douglas, directed by Stanley Kubrick. What an incredible film. Spartacus is one of my favourite films. I saw it when I was very young. And then, can I stay up and watch Spartacus? I was really young, and I watched it, and Spartacus does not have a happy ending. Not at all. And I think it was one of the first films I ever watched that had an absolutely desperate ending. And I choked the tears back in front of my mum and dad, and then went to bed and cried alone in the dark at the realisation of how awful the world was. It was really one of those moments. And this was supported by this incredible soundtrack by Alex North, which is this sort of twisted modernist take on a Roman fanfare. There's lots of it's this sort of modern classical music, you know, writ large, and it's incredible. And the incredible titles that come in, the incredible titles with which uses, it's all got this sort of just these stony, you know, statuesque pictures of, you know, Romans looking tough, and there's, you know, and within this score you have a tune called the Love Theme to Spartacus, which is performed by Carlos Santana on its album Swing of Delight, and it's also been covered by a number. It's a beautiful tune, absolutely. It's beautiful, beautiful, absolutely heavyweight. This is an example of proper Hollywood orchestral scoring, and there's a whole bunch. You know, I could have put on here the score from Citizen Kane by Bernard Herrmann, or maybe even which I do love is this score to The Adventures of Robin Hood by Eric von Korngold, or whatever his name was. There's a whole bunch, Max Steiner. There's a whole bunch of these incredible ones. I really like Alex North. It's slightly later. Go and check it out. I mean, you can put that album on and it just blows you away. It's like listening to some modern classical, you know, stuff. It's just brilliant. Right, at number 7, I have got the soundtrack to the David Cronenberg film Naked Lunch. Naked Lunch is a book by William Burroughs, which is pretty unfilmable. Not only because it would require the most ridiculous special effects to pull off. You could do it with CGI, but most of the things that you would be trying to emulate with CGI would be too offensive for the general public, you know. So Cronenberg then, pre-CGI, tries to take on this film. And the composer he uses for this is the composer that went on to write the music for Lord of the Rings. And the reason why I am describing it like this, because I can't remember his bloody name. The composer. This is the first time I have ever discussed an album where the person behind it I can't name because I can't remember them. Oh, come on. All I've got in my head is Hans Zimmer, and it's definitely not Hans Zimmer. Anyway, he writes this orchestral piece, and it's very dark and moody. And this composer, when he was composing for David Cronenberg, had a certain very sort of a tonal approach to composition. When he then went on to score the world famous Lord of the Rings soundtrack, there was a moment where Peter Jackson said, I want you to go back to your sort of Cronenberg-esque composition approach. And it was when Frodo enters Shelob's lair, and then you're suddenly back in this sort of Cronenberg-esque spot, you know, because that is shot like a Cronenberg film. And even though I've padded my way up to here, I still can't remember the name of this guy. It's ridiculous. You'll put it in the comments anyway. But the thing that's genius about this is to evoke that sort of Naked Lunch William Burroughs thing. They had the genius of bringing in Ornette Coleman and getting him to improvise in his unique free jazz style over the top of this orchestral score. And what Ornette Coleman does is create what is essentially an orchestral piece that has the complete opposite feel of an orchestral piece. Ornette Coleman's able to come in and somehow unstabilize it, that although it's tightly written and orchestrated and arranged, and the musicians are playing exactly what they want, this extra thing in there bubbling away over the top. If they got Michael Brecker in, you would have got these beautiful solo through the harmonic structure. I mean, he made an album with Klaus Ogerman called Cityscapes, which is absolutely one of the greatest albums of all time. But that's what you've got, but Ornette doesn't do this. And I've always been a fan of Ornette Coleman, but I've also find him troublesome as well. I love the primetime stuff. I love Shape of Jazz to Come. Lonely Woman is one of the great moments in jazz. But for me, Ornette's playing on the soundtrack to Naked Lunch is up there with his greatest things. Right, shall we carry on going? Right, at number 6, I have the soundtrack to Apocalypse Now, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, and I assume this has been pulled together by his dad, Carmine Coppola, who was a film composer, wasn't he? Is that right? I actually don't know who composed this. This is an electronic music score. And it's working with a whole bunch of different musicians, like fusion musicians, there's percussionists who emulate the forest, but it's basically this avant-garde electronic music score. Now, I love electronic music, but I never grew up listening to Jean-Michel Jarre, Tangerine Dream, or Tubular Bells, all these albums that seem to come from that. Those weren't the albums that blew me away. I've got those albums, and I do love them, but those weren't the albums for me. For me, the electronic music album that I was obsessed with was this one, the soundtrack to Apocalypse Now. And I played it over and over again. And I think maybe having the film to sort of relate to helped. It's an incredible soundtrack, and it's also punctuated with some of the sort of pop music from that era, so you get all sorts of stuff, including The End by The Doors. Now, The End by The Doors, I can remember having a discussion with Robert Plant about the greatest sort of rock pop song, the greatest song from this era that we grew up in. What's the greatest one of all time? And I said to that, what do you think? I said, what do you think the greatest song? Now, Robert might have just felt in the mood to say this on that day, and the next day it could have been something else. And he went, he goes, The End by The Doors is the greatest song ever written. And it is true. I mean, this is like 1966 when they did that song. Came out in 67, recorded in 66. Rock and roll is just happening. Dylan's come out, you got the Beatles. And then The Doors come out with that, lengthy 10-minute, sort of hymn to nihilism, where, you know, he basically rapes his mother and kills his father in some sort of Greek, you know, rock and roll emulation as he as will. It's incredible stuff. And for Francis Ford Coppola to choose to have that in the final sequence, you know, as Martin Sheen's going to kill Marlon Brando. Oh, this is so powerful, isn't it? It's absolutely powerful. Incredible soundtrack. At number 5, I have got the soundtrack to the film Dancer in the Dark, which was created by Björk. She also starred in the film, and the film was directed by Lars von Trier. Now, Lars von Trier, for me, is an absolute genius, but a very troublesome director, and he's made some incredibly extreme films that I advise you to go and approach with caution, especially stuff like Nymphomaniac. The Idiots. Says that they're disturbing and they're very explicit. His sort of peak culturally was when he teamed up with Björk to make this film Dancer in the Dark. This film is filmed in the sort of Dogma style, on just, you know, low quality hi-8 video cameras, and it tells a story which, like most Lars von Trier stories, is unremittingly depressing and does the opposite to what normal films does. There is nothing. This person does nothing wrong. They're moral, and yet everything just goes from bad to worse for them. I won't tell you too much about the story, but unlike most Lars von Trier's films, this is a musical. This is the one musical I've included. And so this woman played by Björk, who is, she's working in a factory, and she's going blind, but she's got to keep working in the factory because she needs to pay for an operation for her child so that they won't go blind like her. And awful things ensue as the film goes on. But as it gets deeper and darker, this girl has an affinity for musicals, especially musicals by a certain artist that actually appears in these sort of dreamlike sequences. So when she's really in this mundane place, what happens is these mundane sounds that are around her, and this is created by Björk, these sounds start to coalesce. They will coalesce into some sort of rhythmical or harmonic structure that, and you think, is this? And remember, it's filmed on hi-8, so it doesn't look like a film. It looks like real life. It's just people talking like this, and then you notice in the background, you go, this sounds like, is that machine in the background ticking? Has it got a harmony? And then suddenly Björk will just turn around and burst into song. And then suddenly we're in this multi-camera setup, still the hi-8 cameras, but higher quality. But it's just absolutely incredible. It's one of the most incredible musical moments in film or in music. The soundtrack to Dancer in the Dark is it's Björk's greatest album as far as I'm concerned. The stuff she's doing on this is absolutely mind-warping. Her vocal, her mining of the sort of, Hollywood musical tradition, the bringing together of these sort of, how can you describe it, electronica sounds, but the sounds taken from the soundtrack of the film, but mixed with a full orchestral score, which is how this is done. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. And Dancer in the Dark, the album, is one of the greatest albums ever made, as far as I'm concerned. Absolutely incredible. The ones that are above this is truly just down to the huge influence they've had on me. The next 4 are just huge. Right, so check it out. You know, if you're a fan of Björk and we're going, what's the greatest album? Is it the first album or is it, this or that in it? No, it's Dancer in the Dark, which I think came around about 1998, 99, something like that. Absolutely brilliant. So go and check the film out. But I'll tell you something, it's something else. It's not the heaviest Lars von Trier film by far, but it will still, you will wish that, you might want to go for a while before you watch it again. I bought it on DVD because I loved it so much. I saw it, I went and bought it on DVD, and one day I thought, I'm going to sit down and watch this again. So I sat down and watched it again for the second time. And I thought, if I keep watching this film, I'm going to have a nervous breakdown. And I chucked the bloody DVD. I'm not going to watch that film ever again. I'll tell you something. No, never. It's too depressing. Björk's bloody brilliant in it. And apparently, Lars von Trier was really horrible to her as well. You know, and that was the point where she started dressing like a swan and punching people. Anyway, number 4. At number 4, we have got the soundtrack to Clockwork Orange. Right? Stanley Kubrick, one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. We've already had him already, haven't we? Because we did Spartacus, Alex North's soundtrack. Now, the soundtrack to Clockwork Orange was created by Wendy Carlos, I believe. And again, it's this synth soundtrack, and it's the emulation of classical music, but with, you know, Moog synthesizers, monophonics, overdubbed. I think when we talk about electronic music, Wendy Carlos, she needs to have the real. That's where it really was. That's where it's at. She was something else. She is something else. She's still going, isn't she? Of course, when she did this, I think she was then Walter Carlos, but she's now Wendy Carlos. Just to clear that confusion up, the Clockwork Orange soundtrack is very interesting because it's part of the plot. In the plot, this sort of criminal, juvenile delinquent, rapist, murder, and all that sort of stuff is part of an experiment where they try to utilize this sort of mind brainwashing technique to make him vomit when he thinks of the thought of committing crime. But a worse punishment happens in that the one thing he has in his life, which is the music of Beethoven, which he actually loves, the one beautiful thing, is used in this process, and so he then he then loses his ability to listen to the thing he loves, which could be his salvation in the end. I mean, the books are different. You know, it's who Guy Burgess? No, that's that. He was a spy. Anthony Burgess. Anthony Burgess, incredible book. And then Kubrick comes along and sort of skirts his Kubrick way through that book, so which almost obscures it, imbuing it with a new meaning. And then this soundtrack, which is synthetic and futuristic, but actually embodies the beauty of the compositions that are going to feature so much. And then the fact that when this film came out, various people threatened the family of Kubrick, and so it was withdrawn. And so, you know, when I was coming up as a kid, this was a film you couldn't watch. It was like Clockwork Orange, you can't see it. What is it? Oh, he made this film. It's really violent. What the hell's in this film? And eventually came out, and I got a copy of it, and I was blown away by it. It's an incredible film. So that's what I got at number 4, is the soundtrack to Clockwork Orange. At number 3, I have the soundtrack to the French film Lift the Scaffold, or Le Scaffold, or whatever the French one is. Now, this was created by Miles Davis. Miles Davis famously went over to France in the mid-50s. And when he got there, he was treated a lot better than he was in the UK. He was welcomed with open arms. The racism was less. He managed to chat up Juliette Greco, who was a French film star, and he had a bit of a fling with her. And while he was over there, the French New Wave thing's happening. So this is the cutting edge of film. The French New Wave film that happened in the late 50s is a moment of extreme cutting edge. This is where film changes. This is the death of the Hollywood system and what the French New Wave filmmakers are going to do. And maybe the Italian realists a bit like Vittorio De Sica in the 40s, but the people like Jean-Luc Godard and Claude Chabrol and Francois Truffaut, they change the nature of films, and that affects filmmakers like Coppola and other ones that we'll get to in a minute. Anyway, I won't digress down the filmic thing. And of course, these new filmmakers in France, they're very interested in sort of the cool jazz that's coming out of America. Miles is there. So he gets pulled into play on this, for the soundtrack for this film. And basically, what Miles did was they played the film. He put a band together. He's playing with local people. And Miles is up front directing it. And they are watching the film and reacting. This is incredible stuff. I mean, why don't people do this now? You know, why has nobody got the guts to do that now with a film soundtrack? And in doing this, the modal ideas that are then going to appear later on Kind of Blue, but they're evidenced even more. And this soundtrack, the 2 albums of the 1950s by Miles that just blow me away his milestones just because he's got the best jazz group in the world, and it's Cannonball Adderley Coltrane, and they're just mind blowing. But the one that is the futuristic one, the one where he really is going for it, the one that should be seen as being the kind of blue, is essentially upon a scaffold, or whatever it's called. Lift the Scaffold. It's incredible sound. It's just some of the great Miles Davis. It's one of the great Miles Davis. And I bet you, when I did my 10 greatest Miles Davis albums, I forgot about it because it's a soundtrack. You know, it's absolutely wonderful. I actually didn't get to listen to it till quite recently. And when I heard it, I was like, oh my God, it's mind-blowing. And the French players that are backing it up, they bring something else. It's something else that they bring to it. And I don't know whether there was just a more of an avant-garde feel in France at the time in the late 50s, and the musicians seem to be there. They're there with Miles anyway. That's what I got. Number 3 is Lift the Scaffold. Now, if you were to say who do you think the greatest film composer is of all time, I would say Bernard Herrmann. His soundtrack to Citizen Kane is mind-blowing. The stuff he did for Alfred Hitchcock, like Psycho and Vertigo, Rear Window. Did he do Rear Window? Might not have done that one. Vertigo's brilliant. He did North by Northwest, absolutely incredible soundtrack. So don't just rattle off Hitchcock films thinking that if you might, be by Herman, Andy. Just, do the proper thinking. He scored the incredible soundtrack to Jason and the Argonauts. That's just incredible, isn't it? He is one of the greats. His soundtrack to The Devil and Daniel Webster, which I spoke about the other day, is absolutely incredible, with early use of electronic music, early use of studio cut-ups. Bernard Herrmann was like a modern classical composer that was just bringing in so many novel and new ideas to film soundtracks. His final soundtrack was the soundtrack to Taxi Driver, and Taxi Driver is the masterpiece of Martin Scorsese. When I saw that film as a young guy, it just blew me away, and for many years it was my favourite film. Taxi Driver was my favourite film. It's not anymore, but it was, very dark, interesting film. Scorsese shot it on old film stock, so the colour looks like the Hollywood system colour, and yet it's this gritty, anti-moral story. It's an incredible thing. And Herrmann comes in and creates a soundtrack which is completely unlike anything else, and he is exploring modern classical influences mixed with what I probably saw as popular music influences, jazz influences. There's a beautiful, jazz standard type theme. There's beautiful saxophone playing on there, which I think could be Tom Scott, but I might be wrong. I think I said that on another video, and someone said no, it wasn't Tom Scott. But I've always thought it was Tom Scott. And the soundtrack is very blocky because he died while this was being created. And I think Scorsese uses the soundtrack in a very interesting way. I don't know whether he was around towards the end of the film or whether he died when the film was at the end. But it's, I've always thought that the placement of the music in this film is really interesting, and it gives it a sort of otherworldly and almost like a cut-up aspect. The storyline is linear, but when you're watching, it doesn't feel like it's linear. And a lot of this is through these sort of really jarring stylistic approaches all being pushed together. If you think of Psycho, which has a very strong theme, all written on string instruments, all played in a way that sounds like cutting, and when you hear the Psycho soundtrack, you picture the violins in your head, and you picture this idea of the woman's body of the violin with the F-holes in, the cuts that are being stabbed in, and that is all really homogenous, and the whole soundtrack is very at one. This is the opposite to that. Herrmann is the genius. Herrmann is the greatest film composer, I think, of the 20th century, without a doubt. And that's why he's got number 2. So who the hell can beat Bernard Herrmann? Well, it's a soundtrack album that, for me, is one of the greatest albums ever made. It impressed me no end. It's had this huge influence on me, this album has. As has the film. Even now, on this YouTube channel, this film influences me all the time. I go back to it all the time. The film, which I think came out around about 1982, is called Koyaanisqatsi. And Koyaanisqatsi was created by a guy that had been a monk called Godfrey Reggio, and it's based upon a sort of warning from the Hopi Native American, from a sort of a warning that is in a cave about how human beings will destroy themselves through sort of not caring about the environment. This is like way ahead of its time. And it tells this story, and it is a story through the use of stop motion photography. Some of the stuff is very slow, but most of it is sped up. And it starts off in this cave, and we see the beauty of the American landscape. We move across that. We eventually get to the cities. We see human beings. We see the effect of mining, the effect of war, the effect of this, and a sort of mass production that now exists. And there's a cliche that has got into advertising that you'll all have seen, which will be a sort of minimalist soundtrack whilst you get stop motions of skyscrapers with lights going off and on and moons going behind it, you know. And it's become a cliche. Now, the soundtrack was created by the great minimalist composer Philip Glass. Now, at some point, when I'll have to do some research for this, because I'll have to give this one proper justice. I'm going to do a video on the minimalists, starting with Lamonte Young, looking at Terry Riley, looking at Steve Reich, and looking at Philip Glass, John Adams, perhaps. It's such an incredibly important, powerful musical approach that developed in the 1950s. And because the minimalism used repetition had a huge influence on rock music, a huge influence on prog, and a huge influence on modern electronic music. When you listen to rock bands from, Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells to King Crimson to all dance music is influenced by these composers. The great genius of minimalism conceptually was Steve Reich. The great composer for me of minimalism is Philip Glass. And Philip Glass, although he's a modern classical composer with albums like North Star, had almost like rock hit records in the 70s. So he's called in to write this soundtrack to Koyaanisqatsi, and it's a match made in heaven, really is. Godfrey Reggio and Philip Glass, and they create this soundtrack. What's incredible about it, because the film's made out this stop motion, and it does tell a story, but they allowed Philip Glass to create the compositions so they work. Remember that thing I was saying to you about earlier? These compositions work. So when you listen to the soundtrack album to Koyaanisqatsi, it doesn't sound like you listen to a soundtrack album. You just listen to one of the greatest albums ever made. And they took those compositions, these long, minimal compositions, and the whole thing with minimalism, it's a new way of exploring the cadence that exists in Western classical music, you know, the 5/1 cadence, the way that you create tension and then resolve that tension. And the minimalists found new ways of dealing with cadence, which is groundbreaking, absolutely groundbreaking. And often these cadences happen over a long period of time. So minimalism isn't just about repeating stuff over and over again. There is something slowly moving that you're drawn into, and the interest is following that. And it's quite transformational. And when you listen to minimalist music, if you actually sit down and do it, it will have a great effect on you. I used to do this with my students, bring them in, put Steve Reich on, you know, piano phase, switch the lights off and put them in there. And then you put the lights on, they'd be like, almost like, you know, tripping. And Koyaanisqatsi, the film was cut to the music. It's the greatest marriage of visual image and music ever. Absolutely ever. Now, they followed this up with a film called Koyaanisqatsi, which Glass did the music for again, which is not quite as good, but it is very good. And then there's another one that looks at sort of computers, and it was created with computer graphics, and that got very old very quick. Koyaanisqatsi is one of the greatest films ever made. I can remember, I discovered this right about the age of 14. I can remember I was, it was school the next day, and my mum and dad let me sit to watch something, and I didn't want to go to bed. And so I thought, I've got to watch something. And there was this film on Channel 4, very late at night, called Koyaanisqatsi. And so I started watching it, and it drew me in. And at 14, I can remember thinking, how can I be transfixed by this film that's got no story and is just endless imagery, you know, for like an hour and a half? And if I put it on now, that hour and a half would fly by. And the reason is because there is a story. Now, when I first saw it, I was just drawn in by the sort of whole psychedelic effect of it. I've watched it so many times now that there is a message in that film, a message that echoes right to this moment in time. It's absolutely incredible. Anyway, I enjoyed doing this video. I've tried to do these a little bit shorter, just around about the half an hour to the hour, so I know I've gone quick. But if you appreciated that, you know, me going through my 10 favourite movie soundtrack albums, I think that's what I'm going to call this, then you can put a like on this video. And if you want to see some more, you can subscribe by subscribing. And it doesn't cost any money to subscribe. It doesn't cost any money to become a free member of my Patreon as well. And the link is down below there. You can become a free member or a paid member. But don't become a paid member straight away. Just become a free member, then hang out. You'll become a paid member within a certain amount of time. I can't tell you how much time. But you will, because it's absolutely brilliant there. And then if you want to thank me financially for making this video, you know, which is the way creativity happens nowadays. I have a PayPal tip jar down below, the link's there, and you can drop some cash in, and I will appreciate that very much. And anyone who has done, I thank you so much. And I am finished. I'm going to do one more of these, but it's freezing cold in here. And that's it. I think I'll be done. All right then. Bye-bye.